Welcome to my daily chorus. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. It is Friday, August the 8th. And today I wanted to focus on what's happening with the economy, what the government's doing about it, and a moment I think that is important in our political economy. Yesterday, in a really surprising move, Simon Bridges, former National Party leader and minister, and a colleague of many of those who are now ministers in the Luxon-led government, came out and said it was time for the government to get the animal spirits moving again in Auckland and to add some stimulus to the economy. This is at odds, of course, with the government's strategy of cutting government spending growth in order to reduce the government's deficit, reduce its borrowing, and through that, lower interest rates. However, we've had 225 basis points of rate cuts. We've seen the government freeze its construction spending plans through Kāinga Ora and hospitals at the beginning of last year, and at least briefly on schools. And that's cost more than 10,000 construction jobs. And on top of that, the government has continued to put a sinking lid as much as it can on um, health and welfare and education spending that is sucking juice, if you like, energy out of the economy. Now, the hope of the government, using what it calls the incontrovertible laws of economics, is that as the government pulls back, the household sector, so homeowners and businesses, will step forward and spend and invest. But there's a few problems here. This time it's different. It's a dangerous thing for anyone who's in economics to say, but this time it is different. So the national-led government from 1990 to 1999, certainly in its first term from 1990 to 1993, pursued exactly the same strategy. And that's because Ruth Richardson in particular was advised by Treasury and believed it, that cutting spending would solve everything. And it sort of did in a way. And it's a lesson that Ian Rennie, a junior analyst or an analyst in the Prime Minister's office at the time, when Jim Bolger was there and working with Ruth Richardson, believed that running government surpluses, getting government debt down was the best thing any government could do for an economy. And it sort of worked in 1990 through 1999 as the banks, who had been very restrictive, in part because of collapses in lending into the corporate sector and their own issues. I remember BNZ almost went under and had to be bailed out by the government and then bought by National Australia Bank. And so households didn't have much debt in 1990. They continued to increase it through the mid-90s and into the 2000s and really got cracking from 2003 to 2007. There was then the global financial crisis and a relatively brief 10% slump in house prices. But they rebounded quickly because, again, the banks went lending into the housing market, and a lot of rental property investors and first home buyers borrowed up heavily as interest rates fell to get in. Then came the loan to value ratio restrictions from the Reserve Bank in 2013 to start with, and then ratcheted up progressively through the next uh, 7 or 8 years. And certainly that took some of the steam out of the lending growth. But by the time we got to 2021, after the COVID era surge of cash into the housing market, driven in part by the removal temporarily um, of the LVR restrictions, you saw the housing market come off its highs, partly because the restrictions were put back on, and because from late 2021 onwards, interest rates started rising quite sharply and rose to 5.25%. Now, I wanted to show you how important the intervention yesterday from Simon Bridges was. He came out and said, "We need to raise the animal spirits of the business community. The government should be doing more stimulus." Now, that is at odds, of course, with the government's plan, which is get interest rates down. It's not working this time. And the reason it's not working is that banks aren't lending in. They are restricted by both LVRs and DTIs. And the housing market is down at its, well, not quite its trough after the fall off through 2022, but not far off it. And for a lot of people, interest rates, house prices are 10 to 20% below their peaks. And so they don't want to sell. They're waiting for the inevitable rebound, which they've always seen forever in their working lives. But it's not happening because the housing market is in a standoff and the banks won't lend. So it's not just Simon Bridges. Alan Williams, who is the head of advocacy for the Employers and Manufacturers Association, said they had hoped that March would be the bottom for Auckland. Remember, Auckland's unemployment rate rose to 6.1% in the June quarter. But we've been hearing from March until now that things are still very tight and tough. And they've had lots of calls into their helplines from people looking to do redundancies and restructures. He says things seem to be turning around now, but it's clear that the business community are very concerned that the strategy is not working. And if you think that's an overstatement from one statement from one advocate in the business community, you're not hearing what I and many others are hearing behind the scenes by people who don't want to criticize the government public. They are very, very, very concerned that this is not working. And that means the government is under pressure. And we heard yesterday from Nicola Willis. She's not a lady who's going to buckle. She says, I'm open to suggestions about action to support economic activity. And she's looking for, quote, actionable insights. Well, Simon Bridges suggests fiscal stimulus is an actionable insight. She says no. And we also heard similar things from Simeon Brown today, basically just talking to the microphone that they're doing all they can and everyone that just needs to wait. John Key knows that it's not working. And recently he said some things about our economy, which really hit the nail on the head and gives you an idea of what people behind the scenes in our business community are actually saying. So he said to an audience of Auckland business leaders a couple of weeks ago, didn't get a lot of coverage at the time, it should have, thanks to Simon Wilson for picking up on it. I wish I'd been there. So Key said, when house prices go up, everybody tells the pollsters, oh, that's terrible. My son or daughter can't buy a house. I feel really bad. The technical term for that, he says, is bullshit. What they really do say is, God, we paid 1 million for this house and now it's worth 1.7 million. Quietly, they go, oh, we feel rich. Then they borrow some money from a bank, go on holiday and upgrade, i.e. the cash starts to circulate in the economy. So when you have a negative wealth effect, they feel bad. And what he's talking about there essentially is a balance sheet recession. So when people see their wealth, maybe it's a stock market wealth or their housing market wealth, and in New Zealand it's housing market, and they see it down substantially for years on end, they start to lose faith in the value of that wealth and they start to save more, particularly if they're homeowners. To give you a sense, the term deposits in banks have risen by $50 billion in the last 5 years to $250 billion. So when you hear all this talk about people have no money to spend on groceries and fuel, that's absolutely true for renters. But for homeowners, they've actually got plenty. And in fact, many of them, as interest rates have fallen, have kept their payments at the same level, i.e. have repaid debt rather than use those benefits of lower interest rates to spend out there. That is the difference this time around. And again, here's the number to prove it. This is housing credit growth going back to the early 90s. You can see through most of the period up until 2008-9, credit growth into the housing market was running anywhere around 10 to 15%. And apart from one small blip during the dot-com bubble bursting in 2000, 2001, it really did fire up the housing market. Obviously, it went down during the global financial crisis, took a while to get back up again, and then really started humming again over the 4% level between 2015 and 2022. And then it collapsed, of course, when interest rates fell and house prices fell. Now it's rebounded a bit, but it's still only at 2.2%, the credit growth into the market. And a rule of thumb is that you need credit growth above 4% growth annually to really start the housing market cooking again. And that's when house prices are at their peaks and rising to new peaks. at the moment, we've got this standoff where people are not selling, and that is an issue. So, got a housing market with bits tacked on, and now the economy, which is a housing market with bits tacked on, realizes it can't handle the truth of house prices, apparently for years on end, down 10 to 20%. And we're going to have this debate all over again. And Chris Hipkins is starting to talk about it. You might recall I pointed out that Vernon Small, the economics advisor to Labor ministers in the 2017 to 2020 government, said in his column in the Sunday Star Times on Sunday that the Labor Council had decided in the end, in a close vote, to go ahead with the same old policy of a capital gains tax beyond the family home instead of a wealth tax. And I think that's a mistake, because if you leave open that effective huge tax break for people to save money in their own home, they will do it, because there is no incentive to save in real businesses, like in other countries where they have tax breaks for putting money into pension funds, like Australia. And with that hole open up into our tax net, the money's still going to flow. Remember, houses that people live in are still worth more than $1 trillion out of the $1.6 trillion of the housing market. So closing the rental property investor tax area is not going to solve this issue. We need, in my view, either a wealth tax that covers residential property that people live in and own, or a land tax on residential value land. So that includes the family home. And just to show you why the government just will not relent on this fiscal stimulus idea, again, Treasury came out yesterday with its final version of the long-term insights briefing, and just hammered again its cultural view that New Zealand's the best thing any government can do. Remember, Ian Rennie, analyst in the Prime Minister's office in 1991, his views forged in the fires of trying to fend off a double-notch downgrade by Standard & Poor's, advising Ruth Richardson to cut, get government back into surplus, reduce government debt. And you can see there from 1991 onwards, net debt, as the Treasury measured it then, fell from 50% of GDP to nothing. And it has risen back towards, according to that measure, 40% of GDP again. I don't accept that measure because it doesn't take into account the New Zealand Super Fund or the ACC Fund, both of which are very government-owned assets and would be used to offset the extra costs of health and ageing as we go through the next 20 or 30 years. So I think the Treasury is wrong here. We do not have a debt problem, and its view that we have to keep a debt around 30% or lower to have so-called money in the bank for a rainy day is a continued intergenerational crime, because it means you cannot invest in infrastructure for future generations. In fact, it caused 30 years of underinvestment and underfocus on infrastructure simply because they thought debt reduction was the best thing ever. And this was a cultural view formed in the era when bond vigilantes ruled okay, when James Carville, the Democratic strategist, coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," and which turned the third way Blairite Labour politicians of the Anglo-American world into the same deficit hawks that the centre-right has been. And that was a mistake, because those bond vigilantes, maybe they never existed, but they existed in the early 90s. They don't now. There is enormous waves of cash as people have gotten richer, and well, some people have gotten richer and richer, which they want to put into government bonds. And it's why there is 4 to 5 times the amount bid every week for the New Zealand government bond issues that we have at the moment. And even in the United States, where they do have a debt problem, there is plenty of demand for those government bonds from investors. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was today's Daily Chorus for Friday, August the 8th. And if you happen to be looking at this and you're not a paying subscriber to the Kaka, that's because paying subscribers have asked me to open this up for public viewing. And we'd love you to join us as paying subscribers because it helps me do this work in the public interest on our political economy around housing, climate, and poverty. Ka kite anō.